Hello there, this is Dhiru Munduluru and welcome back. So now let's start off by looking at what a version control system or VCS in short is. There are three main reasons for using a VCS. One is team collaboration. Second reason is to have multiple versions of your project code. And the third one is to have a backup of your code. So those are the three reasons. And by team collaboration, I mean when you have a team of developers working on a single project, you would want to use a VCS. So that's the typical use case, and that's really wonderful because all of the developers would be working on the same source code, and these developers can be spread across even different parts of the world. Now, even if you are an individual developer implementing your next big idea, you would be better off using a VCS. That way, your code can be accessible from multiple machines. And moreover, if you want to have multiple versions of your source code, then VCS would take care of it. So you don't have to manually save your files in an external hard disk. Okay, so you can get rid of this one. So if you mess up any of your program, you can always roll back to a previous stable version. Okay, so that's a nice feature of VCS. And finally, you also have an insurance against system crashes. So you don't have to worry about your system getting crashed because your source code is saved in a remote repository. So there is a remote repository, and it would be a remote server or a site like GitHub. Now, initially, this would be set up by a project lead or a system admin, but then we also have a developer. And this developer would be having a working copy of your software, of the project code. Okay, so this is a developer, but let's say the developer has just joined the company, in which case he needs the code. So for that, they would make a copy of the code from the remote repository, right? So they need to download the source code, and this process is referred to as cloning the repository. So the term that is used is cloning, all right? So that would be done for the very first time, and then after that, the developer would do some updates, and then he would merge the code back in the repository, and then at some other point, he would download the code. But from second time onwards, it would be called as update. So first time it is cloning, and second time it is update, or another term is checkout. So they would update their working copy or working directory, then they would make some changes, and finally they need to merge those changes into the remote repository, and we say that they are committing the code to the remote repository. So the code would be merged into the remote repository, and another term for that is check-in. So you would do update, and you would make some changes, and you would commit your code. So the terms are update and commit, or checkout or check-in. Now the convention is typically you would update your code at the beginning of the day, so that way you would have the latest version of your code. So all the edits that your team members have made the previous day, including yourself, and then you would make changes, and at the end of the day you would commit your changes. Okay, so here we have a single developer, but typically we would have multiple developers collaborating on the same project, right? So, and they would also update their code just like you, and they would make changes, and they would also commit the changes back into the remote repository. So version control system is taking care of all of this. It is helping you in merging the code. Okay, if you are working on a single file, if multiple developers are working on the single file, and when they commit the code, then it ensures that they are merged in a proper way. And it is also enabling and maintaining the different versions of your code. So whenever you commit a code, a new version is created. All right. Now, this particular setup that we are seeing of VCS is called as a centralized version control system, and subversion, or SVN in short, is one example of this. It's a wonderful version control system, and we used it at one of my companies that I was working on previously. So this was from 2009 to around 2014, and we were around 35 to 40 engineers spread across 2 different countries working on the same project. Okay, so we would all use the same code base, and most of us were using Eclipse. So we were using SVN from within Eclipse. So that's the thing. And a typical workflow for your code changes to be seen by other developers would be, first you would commit or check in your changes, which would be the files that you have changed. So you would commit only the files that you have changed, and then other team members would have to update their code. Okay, so they would execute an update command or checkout, and then they will be able to see your updates. So that's the typical workflow, and that's the centralized version control system. But these days, a distributed VCS is more popular, and Git is an example of this. And here also we have the remote repository, which has the versioned code, and we also have the multiple developers, but the developers will not directly interact with remote repository. So they will have something called as a local repository on the same machine, and they would interact with the local repository. So they would still execute the update and commit commands, but they are run against the local repository, and it also has versioned code. And the local repository will in turn work with the remote repository because it needs to have the latest version of the code. Or it needs to have a copy of the code. It need not be the latest version, but at some point it would be the latest version, and for that it would execute these commands called as push and pull. Pull would be to get the latest version of the code, and push would be to push the changes from the local repository to the remote repository. Now, for your changes to be visible to other developers, let's see what the workflow would be. So the first thing that you would do is you would commit your changes to the local repository. And then from the local repository, the changes would be pushed to the remote repository. And then other developers would have to pull the changes or the latest version from the remote repository into their local repository, and finally they would update their working copy from the local repository. Okay, so those are the 4 steps. But with Git, the pull command provides you with certain convenience. So instead of having to pull and then separately update, when you execute a pull command using Git, it would do both pull as well as update. So it would pull into the local repository, and then it would be followed by an update into the working copy. So Git does provide that convenience, and if we are using at least Eclipse, there would be a way to both commit as well as push using a single button click. So that's possible, and we will look at that. So that's an introduction to VCS, and I hope you enjoyed learning about it, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.